Now we're going to get down to the nitty-gritty of what Indians are all about.
I still say we Indian people are believers in the truth. This is the way of life that was given to your people. You're born an Indian, you're going to die an Indian. Indianness is a good life. You're facing an Indian this afternoon.
This week on Muskogee Vision, Angel Ellis welcomed Brenda Golden for a new segment of Deep Dive. In this deep dive, they discuss legislation at the state level to establish a phone alert for missing Indigenous persons.
All right, good morning and welcome to our latest segment of Deep Dive. We are in the studio with Brenda Golden, and today we're going to be talking about some red alert legislation that is geared toward helping in the missing and murdered Indigenous people epidemic. I want to introduce our guest to you. It's Miss Brenda Golden. She's come in and she is an attorney, and she's Muskogee Creek citizen, and she has been instrumental in helping getting some legislation authored that she hopes will impact this crisis we're seeing all over the country. But for Oklahoma in particular, it is a piece of legislation that we're kind of calling the Red Alert. It's going to set up a system in which people who are Indigenous and who do go missing or are in danger can be helped, and it can create better outcomes for those situations. And Brenda is also an advocate with the Missing, Murdered, and Indigenous Women Indian Capital chapter. And can you tell us a little bit about that organization?
The organization MMIW Indian Capital is headquartered in Anadarko, and about 5 years ago, my friend Sharice Redbone sent me an email and asked me if I could help with some bylaws and setting up a new organization. Little did I know that it was MMIW Indian Capital. And since that time, every year they've had an event at the Capitol. They do marches, they do rallies, and I believe now there are 8 or 9 MMIW chapters, but MMIW Indian Capital was the very first.
Okay, and is that in Oklahoma?
It's in Oklahoma, Anadarko, yes.
Anadarko, Oklahoma. And what is some of the things other than, like, do they advocate? Do they help people with resources in emergency situations?
They do, and they also help search, bring together search parties, and when someone goes missing in their area, they try to reach out to the families and see what assistance they can provide. If it's getting an advocate to go with them to talk to the police, or whether it's actually boots on the ground searching, they kind of cover a wide variety of just whatever is needed to help that family at the time.
So we've brought up their Facebook page. I didn't know if there was a specific website that had any more information, but I have their website page up, and they have different information that people can kind of stay linked in on and see what's going on. Let's kind of talk a little bit about the situation that arises that creates the need for these chapters, and that is that Indigenous people can be in danger or they go missing, and this has become a crisis, and the outcomes are very poor at this time for getting those people safely back home, or creating teams that can go looking for them. Can you talk a little bit about some of these statistics that we're seeing coming out of this?
Well, as you may know, a lot of attention has come upon this subject in the last couple of years, but it originally started about 30 years ago in the 70s when women in Canada started, they call it the Trail of Tears. They began going missing on this certain highway in Canada, and it's called the Highway of Tears. And so that was kind of the when people first started becoming aware that this is an issue. But of course, we know that Native American women have a long history of being abused and trafficked all the way back to the first colonies. But
Right.
the missing and murdered Indigenous women efforts and here in Oklahoma and across the United States, I would say in the last 2 or 3 years, based on the statistics that we started seeing coming out of studies from the FBI, from the Department of Justice. And one of the problems is that no one was keeping track by the American Indian or Native American status of, and so the numbers weren't. You put someone into the database, the national database for missing persons, there's no way of knowing how many of those are Native American or American Indian because they just weren't tracking them.
Can you talk about some of the scenarios and stereotypes that play out in the situation? So someone has, a family member, a friend, sibling has reported their relative as missing. Can you talk a little bit about that scenario that plays out that lends to this being a problem?
Well, the problem here in Oklahoma that we heard at the interim study that was sponsored in November at the state capitol, legislators had members of communities come forward and give testimony about their experience with law enforcement and they're reporting missing people. And over, the theme was that when the family member would go to report their loved one missing, the police or the law enforcement agency didn't take it seriously and said that they'll be back, they wouldn't take the report, or they didn't search for them. They might actually take the police report, but they didn't do any active efforts to try to locate that missing person. And by the time the family made enough noise or people kept going back to the police department, the trail was cold. And we heard that from several families over and over.
We've seen that scenario play out even right here in this county. Just being a member of the media, we've seen a family come to the media, tagging us on social media, saying we're looking for a loved one. We believe they're in trouble. And whether it was someone else was involved, taking them, or they were just, in a dangerous situation that wasn't going to benefit them health-wise, these were individuals searching for their family member on their own days after, they had spoke to law enforcement. And then it turns out, we covered this, case, and I haven't asked for specific permission from the family to reshare a name or anything, but we did see that ended in people discovering, law enforcement discovered, a body rather than recovering a person and bringing them home. That leads us into what I wanted to address first is the red alert legislation. And can you tell us a little bit about that legislation and what your role is with that?
Well, as I said, the families had said that, one, law enforcement agencies weren't taking them serious, and two, the media wasn't responding by putting the faces of their loved ones out into the public. So the red alert will address both of those, and some of you may get an alert on your phone when a child goes missing. That's an Amber Alert, and they have a Silver Alert for elderly people that are considered helpless or having dementia and they go missing. So a Silver Alert has another one, and what happens is they put them on the signs on the public highways. All the law enforcement agencies get a bulletin, and they have a photo. The media is then alerted that someone is missing, and so it patterns the Silver Alert and the Amber Alert. And I approached the MMIW chapter before the legislative session, and I said, we really need to get someone to sponsor this bill so that there's an alert system. I found that was one of the biggest needs from that testimony, and I drafted it and sent it to the MMIW Indian Capital Chapter president, and they took it to Representative Daniel Pay in Lawton, and he sponsored it for us. Okay, and then we have a local representative, Logan Phillips, who is partially covers Okmulgee County, Okfuskee Hughes, who's signed on as a co-sponsor of this legislation. So I'm very pleased by that because of the Muskogee people that live in this area.
So what I've got pulled up on our screen, and for our viewers who might be tuning in and watching, this is coined phrase Red Alert Act. And as you said, it's supposed to set up a system kind of mirrored with the Amber Alert system. And one of the things I think that legislators found when they adopted that system was that early reporting is critical to affecting that outcome for recovering a person in danger.
Yes.
And this legislation, as we've kind of picked through it, sets up the systems in which local law enforcement communicates with, the OSBI, the county, the state agencies, even tribal jurisdiction authorities would be able to communicate across those different platforms and systems and get the word out really early that someone might be in danger and they might, need to take action now. Can you talk about any of the particular segments that you thought were really critical for bridging that gap between the agencies, so to speak, and what that communication, cross-agency communication does for those outcomes of a person in danger?
Well, the more information that gets out about a missing person that has their photo, their vital statistics, the better. And currently, as you mentioned, there are some barriers to communication between tribal and things like the local law enforcement agencies. And this would create that system where it's a mass distribution broadcast of this missing person that's in danger. In fact, one of my friends yesterday posted on Facebook that 2 people were seen being abducted in a parking lot, and some people assisted them in getting away. And I thought that's the kind of information that a red alert would address immediately.
And in this legislation, I'm just going to kind of highlight it on the screen for our viewers. It says alert shall mean that the statewide red alert for missing Indigenous persons, and it shall include, it talks about the relationship with media outlets, radio stations, TV stations, newspapers, local support organizations. And we're kind of familiar with that system. It already is in place for, as you said, the Amber Alert. And what happens in those scenarios tends to be that, a picture goes out, the height, weight, what they look like, who they were last seen with, if they have the information of a car tag. Everybody can even get those alerts on their phones. And the data reflects that those kind of alerts improve getting that person home. We see that happen a lot. And of course, we also see scenarios where there are bad outcomes, but it does reflect that there's an improvement to recovering and better healthy outcomes for those families, for those people who are in danger. When we look at some of the barriers that have created this epidemic process, can you speak to any of those jurisdictional relationships and what that looks like, how it plays out? Because I kind of have seen, it's been mentioned in the media before, maybe something has happened on tribal land, but then our tribal, light horse don't exactly have
the resources
or even the jurisdiction to go to Oklahoma City and knock on a door in an apartment. That isn't tribal land. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, currently there is a bill introduced called Ida's law that's named after Ida Beard, who went missing in 2015, that would address some of the jurisdictional problems. And as you may know, when a crime happens on tribal property, whether it's restricted or trust land or even what's owned by our own tribe, like the complex, if something happens on the complex, the tribal jurisdiction prevails.
Which bill is this one? I got the 4 ones listed here.
Ida's Laws, House Bill 33. I don't think you printed it out.
Okay.
It was introduced by Representative Mickey Dolenz.
Okay, let me try and find it real quick.
And so it becomes a question of who has the authority to investigate, who has the authority to start the process of searching, who should take the lead if it happens on tribal land, and what's a real problem is that you never know, because there's no map right in front of you with a line showing where the jurisdiction ends and stops. So it causes an issue when you have restricted land next to regular fee land next to trust property. And the IDAS law would help address that issue, because it would have a missing person specialist at the OSBI to help communicate with all of those parties when someone goes missing.
And I've pulled this up for our audience to look at. It's House Bill 3345. As you said, Mickey, Dollins has sponsored the legislation, and it's also the same bill that creates that position in the OSBI to serve as kind of the indigenous expert on these situations. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, I think that this is a major step in meeting the federal task force that President Trump has set up. We also have a person assigned from Oklahoma. We have a task force here in Oklahoma. And so this person is critical to as a linchpin to the communication between the tribal officials, local law enforcement, county, state. That person would be tasked with communicating and addressing all of those.
So those jurisdictional problems that kind of rise up, they would be the one. And I don't know if the audience is really familiar with what I'm pulling up here on the screen. I wanted to take just a brief second to show them that as I'm looking for these laws, and I'm finding them on a really handy website that I've been using, and it is called Legiscan. And you can type in bill numbers or even text, like I've done here in this full text search. And I just typed in IDA's law real quick, hit search,
and it brought it up.
And it brings it up. If people were wanting to follow along and check out what we're talking about here, that's how we're finding it. It gives the bill summary. It also has some really handy tools and buttons where you can see who sponsored the legislation, and it will show you that information. You can get the text. If it comes to vote, you can see the votes on this legislation. You can look at the research that was used to author this legislation, and you even have a button where you can track legislation, so you can put in your email address.
Exactly.
If you're following along with a certain thing, you want to know how well it's doing, you can get your email in there, and you can get alerts to your email seeing exactly what the legislation is doing.
And may I just point out, I have entered my email to track all 5 of the bills that could possibly address missing indigenous people, and none of them have been introduced at the committee level.
They're still in subcommittee status.
They have to be introduced in committee to get on the floor, and they'll be dead at the end of February if they're not introduced by that time.
So what's important for people if they really think these are good pieces of legislation? The general public out there, what can they do to kind of affect that change?
Call and email their representatives and the representatives that are on those committees. It's the Public Health Committee, the Public Safety Committee, and the Public Health Committees that have these pieces of legislation. And if they're really interested, they can go to the Capitol and speak with those people. We are all having a lobby day at the Capitol on February 17th. The Cheyenne and Arapaho tribe has a whole half day that the government, the tribal government, is going to the Capitol en masse to lobby for IDA's law. And I just wish more of our tribes would do that.
And like that presence, what do you think that does for these legislators who are, maybe on the fence about some of these issues? Does it change their minds? Or have we seen these outcomes where they're like, okay, here's a group of people and they really do care about it. Maybe I should, when they see their constituents face to face. But the Red Alert and then IDA's law isn't the only legislation out there that's aiming to or has the potential to affect missing and murdered Indigenous peoples epidemic in Oklahoma. And I had a question for you. Is anyone else out there in the U.S. doing a red alert right now, or is this something that is trending? Is it something that we can adopt and it's been working somewhere else, or could this be an instance where we're at the forefront of leading a charge on something that's really, really affecting Native people?
This would be the very first and only state on the red alert. There are other states that do have the missing persons. There's, last time I looked, there were 8 states that have legislation addressing missing and murdered Indigenous people with either a missing person specialist or a task force. But Oklahoma has the highest number of Native Americans in the United States per capita. We have 7% of the population here in Oklahoma. And Oklahoma is the crossroads for human trafficking because of I-40, I-35, and I-44. I mean,
but no one else is really doing a red alert system.
No one else is doing a red alert system.
So this could be the opportunity to really step up and say this is being a powerful tool used for protection of Indigenous people. When we talk about a system specifically designated to help out Indigenous people, I feel like some of the critics might say, oh, that's a lot of trouble just for one group. But
I've heard that already.
But this one seems to utilize things that are already in place. It's just a matter, really, of changing the text that pops up on the screen, right? Like, it's not like you're having to implement a whole other, system of communication. It's already being done.
It's already done. And so the cost would be very minimal, if at all. And I think that some of the problem is the perception of treating Indigenous people different and giving them a special status, when in fact it should be looked at as addressing a problem, not about the people, but addressing a critical problem. If it's going to save someone's life, who cares what they look like or what race they are? We're not going to ask for them to whip out a citizenship card in order for a red alert.
Right. Just put the alert out, and
put the alert out.
You don't really, like an Amber Alert or a Silver Alert is kind of like they're relying on that family to provide them with the information, and then they're issuing it out through a system designed to specifically help. I had a little part of the red alert legislation pulled up that I thought was really interesting, and it states that. Where did I find it at? It talks about the national crime reporting status of that alert, and I am trying to find it right now. I might have went down too low.
The national status?
Well, national reporting. It dealt with national reporting. I read it somewhere in here.
Oh, report the individual through the National Crime Information Center.
What line was that?
NCIC. And as I mentioned earlier, where did I just see that? It is on page 5, number 3.
Okay, find out what page I'm on. Page 5, number 3.
The numbers for missing Indigenous people have been underreported because, as I stated previously, no one was putting those into the national database. Currently, there are some people that run their own databases, and that's where we get some of the statistics. But the NCIC is like the Department of Justice.
And I think that that's kind of critical too, because if you see a person taken away from where they're at, it's not general that they're just going to drive down the road 10 miles and stay there. It's usually they're getting out of Dodge and they're going somewhere else with that person, and creating that national, tapping into the national network quickly and can effectively, bring that person home. Can you talk anything, I'm not real familiar with all the components of Amber Alert and what it does, but, we see Amber Alerts all the time that someone's from the next state or, in that different region even, but when they believe that they could have a reason, they put these things out. And can you talk about that a little bit, like how that information collection happens when a person, say, I'm going into the sheriff's office and I'm self-identifying as Native American, someone I love is missing, and I believe there was someone who's
dangerous.
Yeah, who's dangerous. maybe they have connections to Florida. And can you talk about how that process kind of works a little bit?
That would trigger the red alert, and of course, then the law enforcement agency would send that information both to the national data bank and to the media, so that it could be distributed. And so that would be like a really major step forward in stopping, again, not only missing people but human trafficking. And the way that the national of course, as you probably are more aware than I am, the way that the national works is that facilitates if they cross state lines, which then it becomes a federal crime.
And it's different classification of crime there. I wanted to take a little bit of a second to pause and let folks know that if you're watching right now and you have some questions that you'd like to ask while we're live with the information, shoot us a question in our YouTube channel chat forum. And you can also comment on Facebook. We're running the links live. And if you have some really important questions you'd like to ask that deal with either Ida's law or the red alert law, hit us up and we can kind of ask questions right now while we have the expert in the chair. Otherwise, we have that additional and supporting legislation that's out there also in the same status. It's not been brought to the floor.
Exactly.
Hasn't, gotten through committee yet, and they are probably pretty crucial components to assisting in positive outcomes, getting people home, keeping people safe, especially for missing, murdered, and Indigenous people. And I was going to jump over to House Bill 2848 really quick here. And can you talk about this piece of legislation a little bit? And that's the one that deals with training.
Yes, all officers in the state of Oklahoma, in almost every jurisdiction that I know of, has to be what they call CLEAT certified, which is the Council on Law Enforcement Education and Training. Provides annual training to new officers, and then every year they have to go back and be recertified and take so many hours of training. We believed that what was missing from their training was a component about why Native American women and people are vulnerable to being human trafficked. Why is this a problem here in Oklahoma? And so we asked for a bill to be introduced for 1 hour per year, just 1 hour, on missing and murdered Indigenous people and possibly cultural sensitivity. Because the stories that we heard over and over were that the police officer would tell the family, oh, she's off drinking, or she's off drugging, or, don't worry about it, she'll be back. And then
it's almost like the stereotypes perpetuated, and that they just expect, stereotypically, their stereotypical understanding of our culture is kind of feeding into this horrible epidemic that's kind of, it's not kind of affecting.
The stereotype is the reason for this epidemic, actually.
Yeah, it's kind of the genesis of it all.